Daily news and analysis. We keep you informed and inspired.
This is World Today.
Hello and welcome to World Today. I'm Ding Hen in Beijing. Coming up, Xi Jinping calls for demand-driven growth in China's services industry. The United States and Iran agreed to provisional ceasefire, with Tehran saying it will reopen the Strait of Hormuz. Initial public offering on China's A-share market surged by 56% in the first quarter from a year earlier. And an Indian business delegation has visited China to discuss EV cooperation and more. To listen to this episode again or to catch up on our previous episodes, you can download our podcast by searching World Today. First up, Chinese President Xi Jinping has called for striving to break new ground in the high-quality development of the country's services industry. He also urged the efforts towards specialization and the higher end of the value chain. The Chinese leader made the remarks in a message conveyed to a national conference regarding the services industry. Xi Jinping also said more China service brands should be created. So for more, joining us now on the line is Professor Jiang Gong from the University of International Business and Economics. So thank you very much for joining us today, Professor Jiang Gong. First of all, we know one thing that President Xi Jinping emphasized during this conference is a demand-driven approach coupled with reform and technological empowerment to develop the services industry. What is your understanding in this regard? For example, what kind of reforms is needed in order to empower China's services industry?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me. I think when we talk about demand-driven approach when it comes to the development of new service industries, we're mostly talking about the frontiers of consumption, the new technologies driven services, things that haven't been widely consumed here in China. So when it comes to these new industries, new services, I think we need to provide an environment that is conducive for the cultivation of these new industries and break down these sort of sectoral and regulatory barriers so that these new things can take off very quickly. I think there's a demand there, but it's usually it's a challenge for the business model to take off, and some of them owing to the regulatory hurdles. So I think this is one area definitely reform can be done. And that sounds pretty abstract, but just give you an example. We've been talking about low attitude economy for some time, and if you really look at the the industry development, I think it's far from satisfaction, and there's still a lot of things, new services, new ideas that can be promoted based on, for example, drone technology, right? This is part of the low attitude economy. But the problem is that, to develop anything associated with drones, there's a basic foundation that these drones have to take off and fly. And it's a big hassle for these drones to fly here in China in major cities. So I think, the regulatory oversight of the drones, for example, definitely is something that needs reform, in my view.
So for China's services industry, what could be the key to specialization and claiming the higher end of the value chain?
I think, again, we're talking about new things. And typically, when it comes to these new services, new products, it's always, the challenge always lies in the fact that it can be a chicken egg problem, right? Without a decent product, you don't have demand. Without decent demand, it's difficult to come up with a decent product. So I think, this is where the government can do and sometimes can do less, to do more, actually, right? And to help the industries to take off. I'm of the view that Chinese entrepreneurs are extremely entrepreneurial. Whenever there's a demand, there will be money, capital, resources, human resources pulled in that direction, try to take advantages of these opportunities. But the thing is that we need a good environment for these new businesses to take off.
In terms of creating more China service brands, Professor, can you think of any existing brands that might serve as a role model for development? And in the context of China or in the context of China's services sector, what could be a successful or effective branding strategy?
Oh, that's a great question. I think there are those what I call experience goods, experience economies that a lot of room for growth. I think especially in entertainment, in sports area, these are areas that traditionally Chinese consumers haven't spent a lot of money on. But if you do the comparison in developed countries, the percentage of their family budget spent on these things actually is quite large. I think we need these Chinese service brands you're talking about to be developed in these industries. Other than, for example, in sports, the winter sports, there are many things that can be done, and I can hardly think of a brand, a famous brand in that space, right? Can't think of a strong brand associated with skiing, for example. Right. Skiing is just about to take off in China. It hasn't been a large market, and I think it's a huge potential in this area. So I think especially I think in these experience goods, there's room for growth, and definitely there's room for Chinese companies. So I would imagine that these are the directions of future growth, future development.
Now, for example, in the field of education or educational services, do you think New Oriental, during its heyday a couple of years ago, can be considered as a successful brand?
Yeah, something like that definitely can grow into more reputable and much more well-known brand. You mentioned the education market. Absolutely. I think in China, in addition to states education system, including universities, primary and middle high schools, there's definitely room for private sectors. After school education services, for example, used to be thriving in China, and I think it's gradually coming back. So things like that. As long as there's a willingness for a trade in a market, there's room for growing into an industry. I think this country, our people, is famous for emphasizing education, and I think in the education area, there gotta be a lot more services to be created. I think look at how much money people spend on that, right? On families spend on overseas education, for example. It's a fairly large amount, and I don't see any sort of noticeable brand in that space, and I think it got to be some companies, some brands becoming more prominent in promoting and creating great services that are much in demand by Chinese consumers.
It is no secret that China is a major power or the most powerful country when we talk about trade in goods. However, some say services are nowadays becoming a new front in China's trade. For example, based on data from the World Trade Organization, China is already ranking as the world's sixth largest exporter of digitally delivered services, up from the 17th place back in the year 2005. And also in 2024, China's exports in consulting services, research and development, and technical related activities were well above the exports in iron, steel, or apparel. What is your observation of the role of services in China's foreign trade?
Well, I think, yeah, you're absolutely right that this very rapid development is very much owing to the Chinese internet behemoths, these great companies going overseas. I know practically each one of these famous internet companies, for example, Didi, Baidu, other major brands, they have been expanding overseas. They're trying to duplicate something similar in foreign countries. I know, for example, DD is doing quite well in the Latin American market. Another big brand that we all heard of that has been making inroads even in the United States is the TikTok brand, right? TikTok's extremely popular in the United States. I think, these are great examples of how the Chinese brands have been getting traction overseas and gradually being accepted by consumers in foreign countries. And I think this shows the prowess of Chinese, internet software engineering skills, and the scale of the market creates great technologies that can be duplicated overseas. I think this trend is going to continue, and I think in a free trade, in an ideally free trade environment, we would be able to see more these types of exports of Chinese services. And this is a great trend. It's going to create jobs overseas as well as creating jobs here at home in China. And definitely, this is something that our government should encourage and help, actually, providing more assistance to these companies expanding overseas.
Lastly, when China is moving to elevate its services industry to a higher quality level, what will that mean to the rest of the world? More opportunities or less opportunities?
This essentially means that Chinese services are becoming more and more competitive. In a sense, of course, it's great to China, but the question you're asking is whether it is creating a competitive factor for foreign countries, or more of a sort of a complementary factor. I think the answer is still out there. The jury is still out there whether this is going to be a beneficial thing for foreign hosting countries as well. I think it could be, actually. A good example is TikTok. I mean, TikTok's been widely successful in the United States. I don't think it's a bad contributing factor to the U.S. economy. I think there are many examples of companies and individuals, creating new business models on the TikTok platform in the United States. It's spreading out very quickly, much in demand. So I think it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's definitely a good thing for America.
Thank you very much for joining us. Professor John Gong joining us from the University of International Business and Economics. This is World Today. Stay tuned.
Welcome. I am Chu Zhang, Deputy Director at the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at Fudan University. On the World Today program, we will dive beyond the headlines to uncover the stories, trends, and impacts that connect states across the globe. Join me on World Today.
You're back with World Today. I'm Ding Hen in Beijing. Chinese Premier Li Qiang has called for expanding China-Australia trade to promote mutual benefit and win-win cooperation. In a phone call with Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, Li stressed the importance of steering bilateral ties in the right direction, fostering a positive atmosphere, and consolidating the momentum for cooperation. Albanese said Australia has long adhered to the One China principle or policy and expressed the readiness to deepen high-level exchanges and advance the comprehensive strategic partnership. The two leaders also highlighted strong potential in green cooperation in such areas as clean energy, new energy vehicles, and carbon reduction. So for more on this, my colleague Song Ruixing earlier spoke with Wang Zichen, Deputy Secretary General of the Center for China and Globalization.
So first of all, how do you interpret the timing of this phone call, and how does it signal about the current state of China-Australia relations?
Well, I think the timing is highly significant. This was apparently, it's not just a routine diplomatic check-in. It came at a moment when the international landscape is unusually turbulent. The recent U.S.-Israeli attack on Iran and subsequent conflict in the region has shaken confidence in energy routes and also in the broader stability of the international order. even if the latest ceasefire, which was announced, a dozen hours ago, has brought some short-term relief, but for Australia in particular, this matters a great deal because this country is heavily exposed to basically fuels that has to be imported from abroad, and China was also a major supplier of Australian jet fuel, for example, last year. So when the Chinese premier and the Australian prime minister spoke, the call, as reflected from the readouts of both countries, the call landed at exactly the point where geopolitics and energy security and even economic stability intersect. I think another background is that after several years of hard-won stabilization, both sides do not want external shocks to derail the relationship in any way. Before this current Australian Prime Minister and his government, there was a period of several years of difficulty in the relationship. But since he came into office, China and Australia have basically rebuilt their ties. And according to the readout this time, the Chinese stressed the geopolitical turbulence and protectionism, and Albanese described the conversation as constructive and said it primarily concerned the Australia-China relationship. So I think the message is, even though the world is becoming more turbulent, fragmented, these two countries still see value in direct communication at a very high leader level.
Okay, then Premier Li also spoke of great potential in bilateral ties. What does that look like in concrete economic and political terms?
Well, when people talk about China-Australia trade, it's a very inaccurate way to summarize it. It's basically Australian exports, liquefied natural gas and iron ore to China. That's why, China has been a huge buyer of commodities from Australia. But actually, Australia is also a very good producer of agricultural products, of dairy products. So when it comes to specific goods that can be exported and imported, there are a lot of room to grow. Also, when it comes to political terms, Australia is part of the so-called West. It is one of the Five Eyes intelligence cooperation alliance in the West, and the two sides have frictions in political matters. So I think that this should be understood in a sober rather than romantic way. It doesn't mean suddenly the two countries just agree on everything. So more dialogues, more people-to-people exchanges, and more leader level in-person meetings, which the Australian Prime Minister also mentioned about coming to China at the end of the year 2026. All these are potential rooms for China and Australia.
Mm-hmm. Besides the areas or cooperation that you have mentioned, one area that seems to stand out is energy. They highlighted energy cooperation from clean energy to EVs and storage. Why is this area being prioritized at this point in time?
If my memory serves me right, actually, domestically in Australia, there is no car manufacturing capacity. So Australia actually imports its cars significantly. And, Chinese car makers, especially Chinese EVs, have really revolutionized themselves in recent years and become, the best EV makers in the world now. And so in that area, China has a lot of different EV brands, different models to offer. And secondly, and this has to come back to the timing issue, is that with the US and Israeli attack on Iran, and then Iran attacking, different countries in the region among the GCC. The Middle East is a significant source of energy, and the Strait of Hormuz is also a significant channel of, energy moving from the region to other parts of the world. Now that has been disrupted. So many more countries are thinking about, maybe it's time to shift from a fossil fuel-based, energy mix into adopting and building more green energy to make renewable energy a bigger part of its, energy supply. And I think, because China has championed the buildup of renewable energy, and this war, this instability, this turbulence in the world really reminds everyone that actually when it comes to renewable energy, you can manufacture your renewable energy at home. You can build solar panels and then you can put up the solar panels to produce electricity, which means you don't have to import, crude oil, LNG from thousands of kilometers away. So renewable energy has a inbuilt energy security element into that. And I think with many more countries are, becoming more and more aware of that, EV sales across the world, according to various reports, have actually skyrocketed in the past month. So I think in this particular line of items you just mentioned, there is a lot of potential for win-win collaboration between the two countries.
But at the same time, there are also strategic tensions in the background. I mean, how should we understand this push for green cooperation alongside Australia's role in AUKUS and broader Western efforts to decouple critical mineral supply chains from China?
That has been one of the frictions between China and Australia. Nobody is naive enough in China to expect, Australia is going to abandon AUKUS tomorrow or next year. Canberra has clearly treated it as a core national security decision, and that's the decision that has been made in Australia. Whether, because of the erratic behavior of the United States, whether, Australia will reevaluate its decision, that's something to be seen. But Australia is part of AUKUS. And also Australia is one of the major players in the, Western Critical Minerals Alliance. Well, maybe it's not accurate to say it's Western, but for a lot of quote-unquote like-minded countries, Australia potentially is one of the major players in the effort to diversify critical mineral supply and reduce, excessive concentration in strategic sectors. But I think the way China engages other countries is that China would not let these differences, unless they impact China's core interests, but China would not let these, differences, these frictions to derail the cooperation between China and Australia and other countries as well. I think it also helps that the Australian Prime Minister has previously said that decoupling refers to separating economies, but he has repeated that Australia will cooperate with China where it can and engage in its national interests. I think we have to be realistic here. And so in other words, security disagreements will remain, and critical mineral diversification will continue, but that doesn't prevent a serious cooperation in trade, climate, energy, and also people-to-people ties.
So if we look ahead beyond the obvious areas of cooperation and those existing underlying tensions, what underappreciated strength on each side could help make this partnership more resilient going forward?
Well, I think actually Australia has a huge Chinese expat population over there. It is a very popular destination for Chinese students to study abroad in an English-speaking country. And now that the US has become much less open to international students, so I'm witnessing Chinese students are exploring more and more study abroad opportunities in Australia. Of course, there are others as well. On the Chinese side, for example, the underappreciated advantage is not just its manufacturing scale in the abstract. It is China's proven ability to bring down costs and deploy, clean technologies at speed. All these Chinese strengths in manufacturing, in affordable manufacturing, in supply chain coordination and commercializations that few others in the world can match. And I think there are different elements of cooperation that the two sides can truly tap. And some of that is human infrastructure, tourism or education or, business communities and, Chinese, Australian, just people-to-people ties, social ties. And some of them are actually deeply rooted in manufacturing, in commerce, in business that, both China and Australia have something very unique to offer.
That was Wang Zichen, Deputy Secretary General with the Center for China and Globalization, speaking with my colleague Song Ruixin. More to come. US and Iran agreed to provisional ceasefire, with Tehran saying it is going to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. You're listening to World Today. I'm Ding He in Beijing. We'll be back after a short break. You're listening to World Today. I'm Ding He in Beijing. U.S. President Donald Trump has announced a 2-week suspension of military attacks on Iran. Trump says the pause is conditional on Iran fully, immediately, and safely reopening the Strait of Hormuz. He added that the United States has achieved its military objectives and is now making progress towards a long-term peace agreement. In the meantime, Iran has accepted this particular ceasefire proposal put forward by the Pakistani side. Iran's Supreme National Security Council says 2 weeks of negotiations with the United States is set to begin in Pakistan on Friday. Iran's foreign minister has promised safe passage through the Strait of Hormuz during the upcoming ceasefire. So joining us now on the line is Professor Wang Jing from Northwest University in Xi'an, China. Thank you very much for joining us.
It's my great pleasure.
Well, Professor Wang, I guess anyone who has been watching the situation going on might feel a little puzzled, let's put it this way, because a short while ago, President Donald Trump was still issuing some sort of genocidal threats against Iranian sites on social media. But then he announced this ceasefire, which some analysts, some observers say is on the terms of the Iranian side. And also on the Iranian side, a short while ago, I think Tehran was still rejecting a ceasefire, but calling for a permanent end to the conflict. Why do you think the ceasefire could be agreed upon?
First of all, I think actually both United States and Iran, they hope to reach a kind of the ceasefire. But they opposed, or from even particularly from the Iranians' perspective, they just opposed kind of the very formal agreement that could be reached between Iran and United States. Because from inside the perspective, if United States, the continuation of the war against Iran is not necessary, because with the war continues, no kind of the breakthrough might emerge, and Iran's regime is very stable. Iran's government is very stable. Their economy is resilient. Their people does not want to overthrow the government as United States expected. So when the time goes by, United States does not want to waste any kind of the resources, any kind of the major energy in this war. And also, United States is influenced by their regional allies and regional partners that the war should be suspended. And also from the perspective of Iran, when the war going on, of course, Iran's social political structure is resilient, but they also face more and more economic difficulties. So that's why inside Iranian's government, particularly the Iran president and Iranian's foreign minister and other very pragmatic leaders, they hope that the ceasefire could be realized. So that's why, although there were disagreements, although there were some differences and there were divisions, but the very ceasefire is still possible, particularly on the mediation of the Pakistan. I think that is a very good news. So that's why I think the ceasefire is very important right now.
Earlier, Iran submitted a 10-point proposal to the United States via Pakistan. Why do you think Trump has described that proposal from the Iranian side as workable foundation for negotiations? Does this represent a diplomatic victory for Tehran?
I think the 10-point is a very important. The basic ideas of Iran over what is going on of the war, and also it should be understood very clearly that the so-called 10-point plan is a very important opportunity from the United States perspective that the negotiation could be started based on the plan. But I think it should be most importantly, it should be understood as a kind of the excuse for the United States that they don't want the war continue. So that's why when when so there was some kind of the 10-point plan. United States, according to Donald Trump, okay, this should be understood at the very basis and the important foundation for the future dialogue and negotiation between the United States and Iran. So they are important. They should be treated seriously. So that's why the 10 points plan, if you look at what was the content, it includes actually Iran's maintains very assertive stances, and Iran's stances in the 10-point plan is quite different from the so-called 15-point plan proposed by United States not long ago. So many divisions, actually the divisions are very difficult to be narrowed. But the United States still define the so-called Iranians 10-point plan as a very important excuse to end the war. So that's why United States won't end the war. And then that's why when the 10-point plan emerged, they hope to use this to define that, okay, now we have an opportunity, we can go out of the war. I think it's just a kind of excuse, political excuse for the United States.
Some say the United States is no longer in a position to dictate terms, and any agreement, if there can be any, will have to be based on genuine compromise. What is your take?
I think that depends on what kind of the perspective that you get, because if we are looking at the war that is ongoing, of course Iran enjoys the upper hand, and the United States has more and more less leverages towards the war, and the United States become more and more passive over the future of the war, and particularly when Iran still has the capabilities to continue their attacks against targets inside not only Israel, but also the major targets in other neighboring Gulf Arab states. That makes the United States into the kind of dilemma that the United States have to safeguard their allies, regional partners. But then on the other hand, the United States does not have enough capabilities to do that. It has to maybe mobilize more forces and military presence to give a new blow to Iran. But that is out of the United States now, the national capabilities and national willingness. So that's why, yes, I mean, to some extent, Iran maybe enjoys the upper hands, but the United States still has this kind of the capability, but they cannot mobilize it right now. So it's kind of a dilemma. I mean, the war dilemma kind of standoff between United States and Iran on a going war. So that's why they have to make choices on their own. They have to decide whether to withdraw from the war or whether to continue of the war. So that's why the kind of the very standoff peace now started to emerge. And maybe it's a positive news, but I think it means at least it means the end of the war. It means the new starting point for the more possibilities of the peace in this region.
What could happen over the following 2 weeks? During this period, can the United States restrain Israel, for example, from trying to undermine diplomatic efforts?
Well, I think the diplomatic dialogue will continue, and there may well be no major breakthrough, because if we compare what happens just more than 1 month ago, I mean, in January or in February, Iranian stances that were held and Iranian stances that are held right now, and they become more and more assertive. And also from United States stances, they become to some extent remained with what they once held in early January and the whole February. So that's why the gap is still there. But now United States and Iran, they don't want war. So that's why they started to sit down and talk. But then, as you mentioned, we cannot forget that Israel is also important. Israel is still there. But what can be done? I mean, when the United States decided to withdraw, because when the United States just started to withdraw, they will not supply Israel with the kind of the air defense missiles, and will not help Israel to defend the missiles coming from Iran and into the targets inside Israel. So that's why Israel also has to reconsider their choices to make, to some extent, concessions. So maybe kind of uncertainties. But when the United States and Iran, they decided to go out of the war, I think maybe to some extent the war will end. It comes to the end. But of course, the dialogue will continue, but without any kind of the essential breakthrough or essential result. but it is a starting point, as we stressed many times, that it is a very important starting point for the possibilities of peace coming back to this region. So it's the good news.
Okay. Thank you very much for joining us. Professor Wang Jing joining us from Northwest University in Xi'an, China. Coming up, initial public offering on China's A-share market surged by 56% in the first quarter from a year earlier. This is World Today. We'll be back.
Hello, I am Dr. Digby James Wren, a political analyst and international relations scholar specializing in China area studies. World Today offers unmatched in-depth perspectives on China's politics, economics, business, technology and society. World Today's team of reporters and contributors provides valuable information from all of the world's major economies. I hope you can join me on World Today for the very best insights and news from China, on China, and help to build a better understanding of China's role in the world today.
You are listening to World Today. I'm Ding Hen in Beijing. China's A-share market weathered the Middle Eastern turbulence in the first quarter. IPO funding surged and major indexes remained stable. All 30 new listings posted gains on their debut, averaging 164%. In particular, one stock jumped by nearly 600% to top that very list. Total IPO proceeds jumped by 56% to nearly 26 billion yuan, or $3.7 billion in the first quarter. In the meantime, early first quarter earnings reports are also very upbeat. Of the 32 companies that had released the previews by early April, over 90% expected profit growth. So for more on this, my colleague Zhao Yang earlier spoke with Dr. Chen Jiahe, Chief Investment Officer at Novum Marquis Technologies.
So, Jiahe, thank you very much for joining us. The Beijing Stock Exchange has become a dominant IPO hub here in the Chinese mainland for specialized tech SMEs in quarter one. So, what do you think makes the Beijing Stock Exchange such an attractive place to list?
Well, one of the most important reasons is that Beijing Stock Exchange is comparatively new compared with other stock exchanges like Shanghai and Shenzhen. So it is mainly concentrating in the attracting of high-tech companies to get listed. While we look at other stock exchanges such as Shanghai, Shenzhen, Hong Kong, they are getting more percentages of traditional companies compared with Beijing Stock Exchange. So if we look at the structure of China's economy right now, is that China is inputting more and more resources to high-tech companies and innovative companies. So that means these companies are having a much faster growth rate compared with traditional companies. So this enables the Beijing Stock Exchange to accept more IPOs from these related companies. Therefore, we see much more companies are listed in Beijing Stock Exchange this year compared with other stock exchanges.
And how do you see the overall financing capital markets in policy support ecosystem in China right now to support the startups and SMEs?
Yeah, China is currently having a very strong support to the startups and SMEs, especially the companies in the high-tech sector, but also other companies in sectors such as consumption, these kinds of things. Because China has realized that most of the innovations are really coming from the development of small and medium-sized companies. I mean, if you look at the theory of business is that small companies are actually contributing much more innovation compared with large companies in the past economic history. So China is actually giving much more support to them. And if you are a small company right now in China, you get quite a lot of channels for investment alongside the growth of your company. You get venture capital in the first place, and you get private equity investment. Also, banks are providing special loans to small and medium-sized companies. I think currently, if you are a person with good credit, it's not difficult for you to get 10 million yuan loan from banks as long as you are getting a very good small business. So currently, it's quite a lot of financing you can actually get if you are going to start a small company in China.
And we've seen over 30 A-share companies reporting quarter one earnings previews, and more than 90% of them signal positive results as of April the 2nd. So what do you think is driving the strong earnings outlook?
Well, currently we see, as you just said, 30 companies reporting their first quarter earnings. There is a statistical conclusion, which is that yearly the first wave of companies who choose to publish their quarter one earning early would be the ones who have got very good results compared with last year. So currently, this very small amount of companies are fitting that statistical rule. So that means they are pretty good companies coming out. Think about that. China has about 6,000 listed companies. So this only means less than 1%. So it's just 0.5% of the companies. But if we look at the first quarter, we can see that China's economy has been pretty stabilized. The trade has been good, the consumption has been rising, the property market has got some trend to stabilize. So all these things really, I think, would support a pretty good first quarter result for China's companies.
An active market may be a reflection of the real economy. Data released by the state taxation authorities show that the sales revenues of China's high-tech industries increased by over 14% in quarter one. So what does this tell us? And why are Chinese high-tech industries growing so rapidly?
Yeah, China's the most rapid growth parts of China's economy right now include two parts: a high-tech part and the consumption part. So the growing of high-tech companies basically comes from the fact that China is now believing that high technology is something, the most important thing for China's economic growth. So China's government has been directing a lot of investment and business activities in the high-tech industry. So we can see that the growth of high-tech is really developing because of the leading of the government, and also because private companies and investments have realized the power of the growing of high technologies. I mean, if you adopt a lot of high tech in your company, you see the results in a few years' time. You see the productivity of your production lines to be grow. You see the efficiency of your headquarters to be increased. So with all these phenomena observed, China's private equities and private capital are also very enthusiastic about investing in the high tech industry.
And China's markets have been relatively resilient to the oil shocks compared to the global peers. So to what extent is this due to the country's renewable energy strategy, and how do you interpret the fundamentals supporting this stability?
Yeah, we can see that, amid this, the turmoil caused by this war in the Middle East, China's economy is very resilient compared with many other smaller economies. This is partly because China has been developing so good in its new energy sector. So China is currently having a much less reliance on the traditional energy, including the oil as well as the coal, which China produces about 98% of the coal that we use, but we import about 70% of the oil that we use. So with the new energy, if you come over to China, you can see over 50% of the new cars sold are electrical driven cars. So that means we can actually use a wind power farms and the solar power the plants to support the driving of our cars. We don't have to rely on oil. So that this is really significant for China, because China imports something like 70% of the oil that we use. So if we have a less reliance on the traditional energy, especially the oil, that means China is much more resilient with the economy. And also another very good thing is that if we use much less traditional energy, not only China, but if all the economies around the world are doing this, then that means we are contributing to the cutting of carbon emission of the whole world, which is very a very important thing if you think about the long-term growth of the global economy in the next few decades.
And Jiahe, so with the Middle East tension still there, how is global capital being reallocated? Do you expect investors to maintain or increase their exposure to Chinese assets?
Yeah, I think so, because if we look at the performance of Hong Kong markets in the past few months, it has been rising pretty good. And one of the most important reasons behind this rising is because a lot of global capitals are rushing into the Hong Kong market. They're starting to find out, okay, there are a bunch of very good Chinese companies here trading at pretty low valuation, a very good return on equity, and a very good dividend paid. So they say, okay, why don't we invest? Well, I think we have been talking about this in our program for quite many times in the past few years. and this just turns out as we have been expecting. So quite a lot of foreign capital are starting to realize China's equities are so attractive in all its financial terms. And I think this process is just in the middle of it. It's not finished yet. I mean, currently we are holding a portfolio about 60% invested in Hong Kong stocks and 40% in Asia companies. The average PE ratio of our portfolio is only about 6%, six times, and the growth rate is about 6% per year. So we can see this is very attractive valuation. Think about the second largest economy in the world growing with a stable speed, and the government is always saying we're opening to all over the world. We never, we're never saying we're closing the door to any country. And they're selling you this at 6 times PE ratio. So that's marvelous. I mean, think about SP 500 is trading at 30 times PE ratio. It's 5 times more expensive than China. So why not China?
Chen Jiahe, Chief Investment Officer at Nova Marquee Technologies, talking with my colleague Zhao Yang. Coming up, India delegation visits China to discuss electric vehicle cooperation and more. This is World Today. Stay tuned. You're back with World Today. I'm Ding Hen in Beijing. A business delegation from India has made a visit to China for the first time in over 5 years. According to Indian trade body PhD Chamber of Commerce and Industry, 8 Indian corporations met firms from Shanghai, Zhejiang, and Jiangsu during their week-long trip. 6 out of the 8 companies are startups operating in the EV charging, electric trucks, battery storage, and energy trading. The trip is marking another step in the thawing of relations between China and India. Last month, for example, the Indian government eased the rules to allow Chinese investments into the country. So for more, joining us now on the line is Gao Xirui, political science PhD candidate at the University of Hong Kong. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
So first of all, why do you think India's business community is very much keen to seek collaboration with their Chinese counterparts in sectors such as the electric vehicle-related industries, as well as, say, renewable energy?
Yes. So first, of course, it's because China matters a lot, if not the most important country in the sector of EVs and renewable energies, because China has successful EV vehicles and the largest, around 80% of global solar module manufacturing capacity, etc. So China should be the target state that India wants to study. So that's the first reason. Another reason is that is due to the conflict between Iran and Israel, as well as the United States. Because India's energy security largely relies on the West Asia, especially around the Strait of Hormuz. So before the war, India's oil reserves can sustain around 50 days, and now the war has lasted around more than 30 days. So for India, renewable and electrification, not just about climate policy, they're also about their strategic vulnerability and energy security. Another reason is that India's oil reserves cannot last longer because it exports a large proportion of its crude oil imported. It sells most of them to Europe to earn a benefit rather than keep it all of them as state reserves. So under this crisis, India is in more urgent need of clean energy rather than the fossil fuels.
So, if India wants to become more competitive in the future in the realm of energy technology sectors, do you think it is necessary for India to have some level of commercial cooperation with China?
Yes, of course. My answer would be yes to many dimensions, not because China just now is not just a common supplier, but the core manufacturing ecosystem. And this is especially true in, the EVs we just talked about, the clean energy, batteries, solar, and also rare earth related processing, as well as many industrial intermediate goods. So these are all very important to not only the emerging technology sectors, but also the manufacturing. So it's really important for India to develop strong commercial cooperation with China. And I think one concern India has was that it may afraid that China earned relative more compared to India during the trade, but India actually would also benefit due to, with more commercial cooperation with China, there will be technology proliferation as well as more a competitive market. It would be better for Indian companies to grow as well. So overall, if India wants to compete in the emerging technology sector at speed, so they would need commercial cooperation with China.
Yeah, I guess the sheer size of the Indian market is also very much attractive from Chinese perspective, from China's business perspective as well. So, of course, I mean, the improvement of China-India ties is very much noticeable. Last year, Indian leader Narendra Modi made his first visit to China in some 7 years to attend the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit held in China's city of Tianjin. But in the meantime, how do you think the two sides can accelerate this positive trend in terms of the bilateral ties?
Thank you. You just mentioned that the sheer size of the Indian market is, promising to China, at least from the economic sense. That's a really important part, and that's the sheer size of the Indian market is what China really appreciated. So to accelerate this positive trend in relations is that we need to implement this theoretical advantage into reality. And what's the gap between the theoretical advantage and reality is that there could be that many Chinese entrepreneurs and Chinese companies are now suspicious about whether they could work, their company could operate safely in India. So an important some obstacles would be that they would one is the security problem, so they have to put aside especially in New Delhi has to put aside the border problem and focus on the economic development first. And with that, so that they can build mutual trust without worrying about, some sensitivity.
Definitely.
And security
We hope
checks.
the Indian side can create a sound business environment for Chinese companies. But thank you very much for joining us, Gao Xirui, joining us from the University of Hong Kong. That's all the time for this edition of World Today. I'm Ding Han in Beijing. Bye for now.